Right now, there is a massive American paradox unfolding. Millions of people are working harder, they're producing way more, and yet they're earning less. So today in this explainer, we're pulling hard data from the Federal Reserve, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the Census Bureau to peel back the curtain on this macroeconomic mystery.
It really starts with the question that millions of us share. Why do you feel poorer despite an expanding economy? I mean, you hear reports of record growth all the time, right? But your bank account tells a completely different story. Well, we're not going to rely on political talking points to answer this. We're looking at the raw, unfiltered data behind wage stagnation, housing costs, and household debt to understand exactly why your paycheck seems to just evaporate.
And the answer begins with a number that completely shatters how we view the modern economy: 0.25%. That is the compound annual growth rate of real weekly wages for the median American full-time worker since 1979. Think about that for a second. We're talking about nearly 5 decades of intense labor, innovation, and absolute technological revolution, and the actual purchasing power of the median worker has crawled upward by a mere fraction of a single percent every year.
When we stretch that kind of stagnation across a timeline, the reality becomes pretty stark. Back in the first quarter of 1979, the median worker made $335 a week in real inflation-adjusted earnings. Fast forward 20 years, right through the absolute peak of the dot-com boom, and that number was exactly $335, a complete flatline. By 2026, after enduring multiple recessions, a global pandemic, and massive inflation, it sits at just $376. That is 50 years of history, yielding a cumulative gain of just over 12%.
So you might be wondering, if wages have been essentially frozen in time, where did all that incredible economic growth go? Well, that brings us to the first major suspect in our investigation. It's what economists call the productivity decoupling. Basically, this is the growing structural disconnect between what American workers produce on the job and what they are actually permitted to take home in their paychecks. Historically, in a healthy economy with a thriving middle class, hourly compensation rises right in tandem with labor productivity. They move together. But starting in the early 1970s, those two lines violently divorced. Since then, the value of what workers produce has grown by a massive 72%, yet median pay, when you adjust it for inflation, has only risen 8.7%. You are literally producing significantly more value per hour than the generations before you, but you are not being compensated for that extra output.
And there's actually a fascinating kind of hidden mechanical reason behind this gap called the deflator disconnection. See, when the government measures worker productivity, they adjust it for inflation using an output deflator. That's the price of the goods businesses produce. But when they measure your wages, they use a consumer price index, the cost of the things you buy. In nearly 80% of industries, output prices rise slower than consumer goods. So even if your boss pays you perfectly fairly for the exact widget you made, your real-world purchasing power is still getting completely eroded at the grocery store.
In this disconnect, it's incredibly uneven across the economy. Take information technology, for example. Productivity there grew at a blistering 5% annually, but real compensation only grew by 1.4%. Manufacturing saw productivity rise 3.3%, while pay crept up barely 0.8%. And in retail trade, despite a 2.8% productivity growth, real compensation basically flatlined at 0.2%. The more technologically advanced the industry gets, the wider the chasm becomes between the worker's output and the worker's reward.
Okay, so we've seen exactly how income has stagnated. Now let's look at the other side of the ledger, the expenses. The second structural issue we have to explore is the literal cost of survival, or what the data calls non-discretionary budget saturation. These are the bills you simply cannot choose to skip.
For the modern American household, total annual expenditures average over $78,000. But it's where that money goes that reveals the real squeeze here. Housing consumes a massive 33.4%. Transportation takes up another 17%. Together, just keeping a roof over your head and having a vehicle to get to work consumes over half of all consumer spending. Once you add in food and insurance, household budgets are utterly saturated. The idea of discretionary income is practically a myth at this point. To make matters even worse, the inflation on these mandatory expenses vastly outpaces general inflation. As of May 2026, the General Consumer Price Index sat at about 333.9. But look at the non-discretionary categories. The index for shelter hit 428. The index for medical care skyrocketed to 593. This is exactly why a 3 or 4% nominal wage increase literally feels like a pay cut. Your income might be keeping pace with the average price of a television, but is being utterly eclipsed by the skyrocketing costs of rent, mortgages, and healthcare.
So when wages stagnate and the basic cost of survival skyrockets, a breaking point is absolutely inevitable. How do working-class Americans adapt to this structural squeeze? Well, they are forced into the fallout, and that means taking on immense debt and joining the hustle economy.
$18.8 trillion. Just let that staggering figure sink in for a second. That is the total U.S. household debt by the first quarter of 2026, according to the Federal Reserve. When your wages simply can't cover the cost of living, families have no choice but to bridge that gap with credit.
When we break down that massive burden, we see exactly where the pressure lies. We're talking $13.19 trillion in mortgage debt, $1.69 trillion in auto loans, another $1.66 trillion in student loans. But the most alarming macroeconomic metric here is the household debt service ratio. In 2026, required debt payments consume over 11% of aggregate disposable personal income. That means more than a tenth of the money Americans have available to spend is spoken for by creditors before they even buy a single loaf of bread.
And here is the deeply human element behind all this macroeconomic data. To service that mountain of debt and afford those basic living costs, millions of Americans literally have no choice but to work more. By May 2026, there were over 8.4 million multiple job holders in the U.S. That represents 5.2% of the entire employed workforce. And Census Bureau research makes it abundantly clear, this is not some fun side hustle for extra vacation money. This is a non-discretionary labor supply shift. People are sacrificing their nights and weekends just to offset structural instability and survive.
Economists note a really grim reality for leveraged households. They point out that this structural debt service acts as a direct tax on labor, ensuring that a significant portion of their daily work goes towards servicing liabilities rather than building assets. It's the ultimate treadmill effect, right? You're working harder, you're producing more value, but the mechanics of inflation, decoupling, and debt ensure that you are only ever running in place.
Which really leaves us with one profound question to end on. How long can the American dream survive the real wage illusion? The gap between what we produce and what we earn is widening. The absolute cost of survival is saturating our budgets. If upward mobility and a thriving middle class are supposed to be the bedrock of the economy, what happens to a nation when working harder no longer means getting ahead?